YakChat, a podcast from BlakYaks. In this episode, Ollie Gayton, Head of Professional Services, and BlakYaks CEO Dirk Anderson discuss app modernization on Azure.
Hi, I'm Dirk. I head up the BlakYaks team. Today we're here to talk about app modernization on Microsoft Azure platform. It's the third episode in the series. In the previous two episodes, we covered cloud-native operations on the Microsoft Azure platform. Then we covered enterprise container platforms on Azure. Today, we're here to talk specifically about the challenge of modernizing applications on the Azure platform and the platform itself. And today, I'm joined by Ollie Gayton. Welcome, Ollie.
Pleasure to be here, Dirk.
Do you mind just starting by introducing yourself, Ollie, what you do within BlakYaks and just a bit on your professional background?
Yeah, sure. So I run the professional services team. BlakYaks been with the company since probably about 6 months after the birth. Obviously, previously, we've worked together for, I think, too long. 10 years
10
plus.
years, yeah.
My background, so going back in the early days, traditional data center, so very experienced and sort of competent in that sort of, the DNS Active Directory and server hardware and stuff like that, which obviously is helpful in the later life and what we're here to talk about as well. Been working on specifically Azure and sort of DevOps, IAC, all that kind of stuff for a number of years, probably about 6-7 years now. And I guess, to put it in summary, my team is responsible for basically the delivery function of BlakYaks.
Okay, so you're the right guy, Ollie. I'm glad you've joined us. So
right guy with their calendars free, I think is.
Yeah. So just to set the scene a little bit, when with app modernization, certainly you and I have been talking about for the whole 10 years that we've worked together, and there's at least a decade before that where the industry's tried to move towards microservices architectures for modern applications, and it's kind of intriguing that we're still talking about it today. And I know some of that is to do with the fact that the ecosystem that supports some of that modernization has changed pretty radically, certainly over the last 5-6 years as clouds become more pervasive. There's certainly an industry lean towards containerized applications. Kubernetes as an orchestration platform has come to the fore. But it'd be great to get your own perspective, Ollie, on why are we still here all of these years later and talking about it and working with businesses around that subject matter today.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we have been talking about it for a long time, but I guess when you look at put it in the context of the applications and the age of some of these applications. We might have been talking about modernization for, say, 5 or 10 years. These applications have been developed and bolted onto for 20 years. Yeah. They can be sitting on mainframes, then very old code, and the scale of the problem can seem quite daunting.
Yeah.
So you might have other aspects coming in, say data center closures, so contract expiration on data centers, and suddenly there's this sort of panic. How do we migrate, let alone modernize this application? What I would say to that is don't try and boil the ocean.
Yeah.
So we're working with a customer at the moment, for example, where they've got a monolithic application, exactly that. It's been built up over many, many years. It is running in Azure, but it's running on virtual machines, and not just virtual machines, but Windows virtual machines as well. And we've been working with them to modernize a few services. So they set themselves a goal, and they thought, well, let's just try and get 4 or 5 services running on a container platform by the end of March. We started the project around October, November time last year, so the container platform and all that kind of stuff. And they set themselves an achievable goal. It's probably a small percentage of where they need to be, but the critical thing is that they've started that journey and they can then get some cadence.
I kind of touched on it, and some of this is about platform modernization. So we see it as an app modernization challenge or an application or service modernization challenge. But a big part of this and where you and the team are involved is modernizing the platform in the right way.
Yeah, modernizing the platform is your starting point. What we see quite often is you'll have developers are working with code, with pipelines, obviously. Yeah. What we see is a big gap between the infrastructure teams and the developers. And so one of the things we try and do is sort of shorten or shrink that gap and then bridge it where we can. And we'll see the platform is largely ClickOps, so logging into the portal, clicking on create and things like that. There might be some PowerShell scripts and things, but largely it's a human and manual task.
It's not so bad that for small environments. I know your take, Ollie, is even if there's tens of services, workloads, machines, you ought to be automating this stuff because there's a whole bunch of other benefits that come.
If I don't do something twice, I want to automate it. I'm lazy. But so we see this. The infrastructure is deployed in a manual way, perhaps using quite a lot of old processes. Maybe you go through a request cycle and license allocation and all that kind of stuff, and then Mr. or Mrs. Developer, your virtual machine is ready. Go and deploy your code. And what we try and do is deal with the infrastructure and the applications at the same time. Mm-hmm. So we'll deploy the infrastructure that's required for an application stack, maybe in one pipeline, but critically we'll then go straight into a software development lifecycle process to deploy the applications. And it works whether it's PaaS, web apps, things like that, or container platform. It's the process that we try and put in to bridge that gap between the application developers and the actual infrastructure team.
Yeah, and I suppose unpacking that a little bit, you talk about deploying the infrastructure and the apps at the same time. I guess the mature, well-established application teams have been kind of following that method for a number of years, really good SDLC process. But what you're touching on there is how do you make sure that those methods are applied with the same sort of rigor for the cloud infrastructure that underpins those applications. So when we talk about app modernization, it invariably always touches the platform, whether it's PaaS services, container services, or indeed, virtual machines that, you might want to use to underpin that application still, but you still want to automate that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I see, although we're talking about app modernization, it's the modernization of the application, the underlying platform, and the operation as well. So how you deploy, how you manage that operation, manage that application. I would say that even if you do have a off-the-shelf vendor application that needs to be migrated, you're very unlikely to be able to modernize that. It's a vendor app. They might not have a SaaS service.
And you don't control it.
Right? No, you buy a license and you install perhaps an application server followed by a database server. Yeah. But if you can, in the migration method, or what we advocate, if you can get to that new platform, if you can get it into a cloud and have that infrastructure deployed by code, have the application laid down via something like Ansible, and have it repeatable, then that's still a win. That's still a tick in the box. You might not have modernized the application, but you've modernized the deployment, you've modernized, therefore, the operation behind the management of that application stack as well.
And we see a bit of that, don't we? Where people refer to lift and shift. It's a really simple term, and some people will interpret that simply as taking the virtual machines and lift them into cloud. But you're saying even if you're doing that, go a little bit further than that and get the benefits of modernizing even the IaaS, or the virtual machine estate in cloud, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And what's the start point, Ollie? So I assume that all of that kind of makes sense to the people that are still listening to you and I talk about this stuff. What's the start point in terms of getting your hands around the application landscape? I know we typically work with larger clients, so there's always a bit of a scale challenge when it comes to modernizing applications on Azure. But what's the start point?
Oh, you kind of answered the question. Answer the question in the question there. Understanding your landscape. So I've forgotten how many times I've been involved in sort of an application discovery piece of work, and the customer's been adamant that this application is not used, or there is no upstream services. It's purely just something that sits there, and it's not correct, and it's understanding the scale of, not the problem necessarily, but the scale of the estate is going to put you in a good stead to be able to migrate. Tooling is the first thing. Yeah. I would say you need to understand it. The quick way to understand what virtual machines you've got, where they sit, what compute they've got allocated to them, what storage is tooling. Unfortunately, the bad news is, and you can probably see where I'm going to go with this, is that you can't get away from talking to people.
Yeah, I mean, you and I have talked a little bit about this off camera, and the very notion that you've got these magic bullet tools that can point at a set of virtual machines on premise, magically containerize them, and the application works beautifully well, and it's stable and it's secure. And that really isn't true, and I guess that's where you're going with some of this. There's a bit of legwork to do around that.
Yeah, I mean, tooling is going to tell you, like I say, the technical aspects of what makes up your application. It will tell you what's talking to what, But if it's a bespoke application, it's not going to tell you what that application is. You're going to see all the interfaces, but you might think this application could be hundreds of virtual machines, it could be tens of virtual machines, or it could actually just be one with a lot of integrations. You don't know. You need to talk to people. You then got the sort of the non-technical, the business requirements. What's your RPO, RTO, your DRBCP requirements, and things like that. The only way to get that information is to talk to people.
Yeah, business logic sometimes comes from the human beings that own the application estate.
Yeah, and I know people don't like talking to me, obviously, but it needs to be done. And what we will tend to do is then get that information into a data mart of some description. So we'll typically build our own database and be able to then run analysis and categorize and all this kind of stuff. I guess at this point what we try and look at is what are the opportunities for modernization. Yeah. And I mentioned earlier, depending on the timeframes, whether there's a, like say, data center closure, things like that happening, or whether there's just a budget that can't be exceeded, you might not be able to modernize entirely. But there's a term, sort of lift and shift. There's another term that is out there making the rounds, which is lift and expand, which kind of touches on that first example where you take a service and try and modernize an individual service, whereby you're looking at what within an application stack can be modernized. So is there an opportunity to take a database cluster and move it into Azure SQL, to take a web app and move it into an Azure web app or an IIS box and move it into Azure web app? So where are the opportunities to modernize discrete aspects of the architecture? It's similar to sort of the virtual machine and lift and shift example. It's not your desired end state, but it's still a massive tick in a box. It's still an achievement to have gotten to that point.
I mean, we have seen people put off the transition of these monolith, multi-tiered application stack because it feels like it's too much. But there's definitely a case for starting to do that. Make incremental gains as you go through lift and expand. Almost sounds like a lift and enhance method, but you get the kind of ball moving.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to. I guess until you try, you don't really know where organizations have invested in Azure cloud platforms, whatever it might be. It makes sense to go the next step and to actually start looking at modernizing applications where you can.
And I think the incremental gains aren't always, as we've discussed before, Ollie, they're not always about just the application being modernized. What you end up with then is you're building really good design patterns for an array of cloud services, whether it's containers, whether it's how your landing zones are deployed, whether it's your deployment of virtual machines or an array of PaaS services. If you're focused on making those reusable patterns and you've got migration methods, you begin to see these reusable cases. And I guess it's the opposite of diminishing returns. It's like appreciating value as you walk through that process of migrating service or application by application. You should end up with this library of reusable components that are good for the rest of your application and service transition. And we're a big advocate of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And even, worst case scenario, you've not necessarily got repeatable code, but you've got repeatable methodologies. Yeah. So in order to get from point A to point B, I need to go through these steps. Yeah. You start getting into a process, almost like hand cranking. It becomes second nature to start thinking about, well, I can take this component and move it into this new service. I can take that component. So yeah, it's definitely a benefit to the business. Like I say, whether it's a full-blown modernization, we've achieved, we've boiled the ocean, we're amazing, or whether it's just taking those bite-sized chunks.
And the other bits that we sometimes see is you often find yourself correcting some wrongs. It's not unusual to turn up to a large organization and find that the CMDB isn't quite in the state that you would like it to be. There are missing CIs, and it often corrects that, but there's a whole bunch of other things that flow out the back of just having those discussions inside the stakeholder workshops.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we'll bring tooling, like I said, whether it's cloud native tooling or whatever, because you do quite often ask for your application, a customer's application landscape, and get an export of a CMDB that looks suspiciously old and perhaps not quite as maintained as you would like to have thought. And yeah, I guess on a CMDB in the cloud, So it's kind of related in the sort of the more modern operations, but part of that sort of modernization of the whole application landscape is that I remember asking sometimes rhetorical questions to customers around their CMDB, which is on a scalable platform. What is your CI? What is that actual configuration item? Because take sort of scale sets, for example, where you can have 0 instances or 1,000 instances or anywhere in between. Is each of those, do you class each of those instances as a CI? Yeah. And in which case, how do you keep track of it? Or do you lift it up a level and say, well, actually the scale set resource is the CI, and I don't really care what's going on further on down that. So, and that's a conversation I've had a number of times. And so I guess I was going to say anecdotally, but it's not really. It was a conversation that actually happened quite in the early days, whereby security teams insisted that whether it was the virtual machine, for example, had to have antivirus on it, and it had to be domain joined, even though it was stateless. It was going to be here 1 minute and gone the next. So it's about getting into that mindset as well, which I guess is another key point is bringing the rest of the organisation, the rest of the teams along for the journey.
Yeah, I mean, we talk about, at the risk of offending some tool makers, but there is some snake oil out there where you absolutely can't do this stuff without getting amongst stakeholders, whether that's application owners, security teams, operational teams, even if it's just to agree what the CI is in that context.
Yeah.
And unless you've agreed that, and you can't then go and update your CMDB. So that, the relationship between the service portfolio, what's within that portfolio, who the owner is, and what the individual CI is, ultimately has to change.
Yeah. But
not to mention security backups,
all
some
of
of that.
Stuff. But in order to change it and to understand the scale of that change, you've got to understand what the current state of it is.
And I stumbled into the security point there, and I can't believe we've spoken for 15 minutes and not talked about it, but that is a big part of it, isn't it? When we start to think about modernising applications, you have to look and inspect the application security and how is that what it needs to be. If you start to think about delivering these applications inside a PaaS or a container context, it may change your security design. I know that in a future episode, we're going to talk about DevOps and GitOps and supply chain security and all that good stuff that you need to do when you're streamlining highly automated application deployment processes. But even at the more foundational level, you've got to address that as part of your transition.
I guess when you think about what BlakYaks do, we try and bring those various teams together. As you mentioned, you've got infrastructure, you've got developers, you've got security, you've got operations, and there's a whole host of others out there as well. And we try and bring them along, bring them all together, get people collaborating. I guess from a developer standpoint, you want to get agreement from the business that the developers can start playing with some of these new technologies, be them containers, be them PaaS offerings, whatever it might be. But the only way to essentially achieve that modernization goal is to actually know what's out there and what the art of the possible is. Yeah. And the only way to do that is to make sure that you've got buy-in from, well, the developers are going to want it anyway. Yeah. But infrastructure and security need to be on board with allowing that. And I say with the infrastructure team, they need to have defined what good looks like when you actually formalize a design. So if you've had some developers playing around and they've come up with a great new modern architecture for whether it's a new application or an existing application.
Invariably, they look for somebody to support it, right? So this modern architecture might make a lot of sense for the application, but there is a handover of responsibility at some point back to security and operations to look after it in an ongoing.
They've got to look after it, but the starting point is to make sure that when that architecture, when that application stack gets onboarded into, say, the SDLC lifecycle, it needs to abide by certain controls. It needs to be, perhaps, TLS 1.2 or 1.3. It needs to be fully private. It can't have any public ingress and all these kind of things. Well, that's where the infrastructure and security teams define what good looks like. So that by the time you've got this playground architecture, it then gets sort of secured, and then you've got it into the into that
is a great point, Ollie. I mean, I guess one thing this podcast should serve to demonstrate is you have got to get into all that. There's no magic bullet point and click solution to this, despite what some people might suggest there is. But even talk a little bit more about that, Ollie, the process from, and we're big advocates of, cloud services, they're changing rapidly. The big cloud providers, we're an Azure specialist, but they're all competing with each other, which means that, almost on a monthly basis, that array of services are getting more feature rich month by month. You really want the developers playing with that stuff safely and securely. You'd refer to it as a sandbox environment, and then there's a route to get it from there to production. Just talk a little bit more about that, because I guess that's all part of the same challenge, isn't it, when you're thinking about modernising your platforms and your applications?
Yeah, and it's, again, I guess it is bridging that gap, because if the app devs are playing with these new technologies, but yeah, having a safe sandbox, playground, whatever you want to call it, to enable the developer community to play and figure out how these new technologies can help the business. I mean, to your point, on a monthly basis, you've got to think about it in terms of on a monthly basis, one service in Azure will be updated. So every month, that one service, but there are hundreds and hundreds of services in Azure. So I mean, if you look today, I think I saw 16 updates of new features, either in public preview or GA, specifically for AKS.
Yeah.
So to try and keep track, no one team or one person can keep track of all
and
this
some of those
stuff,
changes
so
may be inconsequential, but some others may take some real planning and
some of them could be game changing. Some of them could release you to modernise, or to develop in a completely new way your application stack. But so the starting point is to have that sort of safe place to do the development.
I think the industry now referring to it commonly as kind of developer velocity, but it's a great way to describe it, isn't it? That speed comes from the notion that they rapidly develop, they innovate, and then once they understand that that's going to become part of their application architecture, that new feature, that's new tool, it's given a really efficient path back to production.
And it's on the sort of life cycle, because I guess you still got to remember the infrastructure side of things, and one of the key bits about bridging that gap. So in an ideal world, and what we try and do, and sort of an example for one customer we have is we developed the infrastructure code for all of their applications, as well as their application deployment as well.
Yeah.
So what you've ended up with is a very, very quick way of spinning up new environments that are identical to previous ones, or even application instances that are identical to previous ones as well. And the only way you can do that is to figure out what it is it's going to look like. That's your sandbox. Then start productionizing and securing your application. That's where your first side of your life cycle comes in, and promoting that through the various environments into production.
And that's easy, really easy to say, but quite hard to get right at scale, isn't it? And we're big advocates, a bit of upfront engineering, get that bit right, and it will be your biggest ally throughout your next year, 2 years, 3 years. It's all about, when I listen to you speak, it's all about method, nailing the foundations, getting all of that right, make sure you've got a really slick process for deploying the cloud infrastructure that's required to run the application, as well as deploying the application. And then, consistent environments. So there's so many gains, isn't it, in terms of disaster recovery, business continuity posture, security posture, consistency of environment, takes human error.
Security and consistency. So the example I just mentioned there was, it came about because the customer couldn't actually use any lower environments. If they ever needed to deploy anything new, it had to go straight into production, because the lower environments didn't look anything like production, didn't actually function properly. So you've got that security and consistency, and obviously there's inherent risk in that, because you deploy a change to the.
When you go to production, you want to be certain that it's what you want.
I'd prefer it, put it that way. But yeah, I mean, in terms of that upfront investment, it took us a few weeks to develop the landing zone code to make, to deploy new environments quickly. And there were about 7 or 8 applications that, again, we coded all the infrastructure and the application side of things. And that took a few weeks, 4 or 5 weeks maybe to do. But most recently, they've wanted a new environment spun up 2 or 3 hours. Yeah. That's the environment. So the landing zone portion plus an instance of those 7 or 8 applications.
So there are some long-term gains to be made by, as you call it, all the upfront engineering, big advocates at getting it right, because then the gains are substantial longer term.
Yeah.
As you'd expect with a conversation, a podcast of this type, Ollie, we're jumping a little bit between application stack and platforms, because inevitably that's what the challenge becomes. But if we think back to the whole application piece again, and we start to go through that assessment, you invariably always run into a set of circumstances, but they're just things that are kind of not known about the application stack for a variety of different reasons. Want to just touch a bit more on your experience of that?
I don't want to say I could guarantee, but I'm pretty confident any organisation going through an application assessment with a view of of migrating and modernising, they're going to come across a bespoke internal application that the person who wrote it left 5 years ago, and they haven't got a clue where the source code for it is and how to maintain it. It might need a .NET upgrade or something like that, and they won't have a clue. It's normal to come across that.
Well, most large organisations, Ollie, have got sizable technology teams, often employ contractors as well as permanent staff, and contractors may have come along and worked for 3 or 4 months, contributed some code, maybe not done the best job of authoring that code, and then you don't know how it was deployed. It was deployed successfully, it's sitting there working. Now when you come to modernisation, you haven't got access to it.
You don't have the source code, you're pretty stuck. You also come across, and again I come across this all the time, customer adamant this application doesn't talk to anything and nothing talks to it.
It's standalone.
And you kind of say, well, can you explain what all this is?
All this traffic that's going between it and something else.
And it does more often than not open quite a few eyes and give give stakeholders a real insight into what their application estate or just their infrastructure estate is kind of looking like. I guess another key piece with it's not necessarily the unknowns, but where some stumbling blocks can come up is around the storage layer. So organisations are going to have invested considerable sums of money,
sometimes millions, right?
In distributed SANs, stretching data centers, all this sort of stuff. Mirroring. You can't lift and shift doesn't work. You don't have an option but to essentially modernise. You have to modernise because there is nothing that's similar. You can use Elastic SAN, you can use NetApp files, you can use native, cloud native Azure storage, for example. But you've got to understand what your performance requirements are, what the size of the storage, because you're moving from, I guess, as you've just said, invested millions, you've moved from that capital investment to a pay-as-you-go model. You only want to pay for what you need.
You should be motivated to just pay just enough. And unless you go and inspect the storage environment, you can't do that.
No.
So we've talked about quite a lot during this session, Ollie. Hopefully some of it's relevant to the listeners.
Hopefully.
But I guess in summary, real quick, I know we're big advocates, you and the team are, of a very strong DevOps and IAC method. It's really fundamental to get that right. And I think we may have covered that in previous podcast episodes. Creating good design and migration patterns. So the architecture on the target end. So if you're in the context of migrating to Azure, you want to create the right target architectures, depending on the size of the organization and what the organization goals is. But love the notion of whether it's virtual machines complemented with PaaS, complemented with container services. When you look at the application landscape and you think about the journey to transition over a matter of 1, 2, 3, 4 years, however long that is, will depend on the size of the organization. Knowing what that target architecture looks like and starting to work towards that in such a way that you've got the architecture that is likely to underpin all existing and future applications. It's well designed, well thought out. You've talked about it here, Ollie. I think you said don't boil the ocean, South African term, don't eat the elephant. But make progress because you got all this incremental value along the way, whether that's getting the foundations right, whether it's building reusable migration method and process, or reusable code and design patterns on the target side is good.
Yeah, I'd say the elephant example is probably one of the most critical takeaways, because this doesn't happen overnight. Go back to your very first question, why are we still talking about this? Because it is quite complex. The best way to deal with it is bite-sized chunks. Achieve achieve a little goal, achieve the next goal, and just get some traction, get some cadence.
Get some momentum. And it's different from organisation to organisation. I know what we didn't touch on here was the very notion that some of these application development teams may already be playing in sandbox. They've already figured out what these modern architectures need to look like in the target. And maybe the join just hasn't been made with the infrastructure, cloud, operations, security teams, sometimes bridging that gap matters, and it will be different from org to org. Or some applications may just go away because the business function that they serve naturally comes to its natural end at some point. So
ditch them, put them over.
That's why tools, point and click. It's the challenge is great on that. I think that if you've got anything out of this podcast today, it will be that. Thanks for joining, Ollie. Thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it. I know you're a busy guy. We covered the subject today. I know it's touched on some of the stuff that we covered in the previous episodes. We are going to cover GitOps, DevOps, DevSecOps and a bit more depth in a future episode. So if some of what we said was interesting today, tune in to the next episode. Thanks for joining.
And if you'd like to get in touch, please email dirk.anderson, ollie.gayton or solutions@blakyaks.com. To find out more about any of the subjects discussed in our podcast, please visit blakyaks.com. You can also find us on LinkedIn, Twitter and Instagram @BlakYaks, and please follow and rate us on your podcast app.